The last thing we're going to discuss in this module is culture. Culture is everything beyond biology that helps us adapt to our environment. It is our shared way of life so that we know what to expect of one another. And there are two aspects to culture. The first is material culture, and material culture are the artifacts, things that you can touch, things that you can hold, the actual, everything from a flashlight to sunglasses to a pair of pliers. These are material culture, tools that we construct, artifacts that we construct that help us adapt to our environment. There's also non-material culture, things like our language and our theology, things that are not physical objects but are nevertheless real, that they exist in our heads. And our culture feels natural to us because we were raised in our culture. But one of the things that we know is that our culture is just one set of adaptations among many. There are many possible ways to adapt to an environment, and that is why there are so many different cultures. Oftentimes, when a person encounters a culture that is unlike their own, they experience what we call culture shock. And culture shock essentially means that you find yourself in a situation where you don't know the rules. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had a friend from Pakistan. He was a new graduate student, and he had just come from Pakistan. And he didn't have a car. He lived in graduate student housing. And he asked me if I would take him grocery shopping because it was a pain to take groceries on the bus. This is the first time he had ever been to a supermarket in the United States. And so I took him grocery shopping. And when the cashier rang up the groceries, the cashier said something like, okay, that'll be $46.84. And Gulzar said, I'll give you $30. And I started to laugh, and I thought it was really interesting because in his culture, you can bargain for everything. And when someone gives you, in his culture, when someone gives you a price, that's sort of the opening bid, and that's where the negotiation starts. And I had to explain to him, in our culture, we don't bargain for groceries. In our culture, the price they tell you is the price that you pay. And now think about it. Having been raised in this culture, you know precisely the kinds of things you can bargain for versus the things you can't bargain for. You can't bargain for groceries, but you can bargain over a car. You can't bargain for, you can't bargain at Walmart, but you know that if you answer an ad on Craigslist and go to someone's house to buy used merchandise, you can, haggle over the price. An easy way to experience culture shock without having to fly to another country is to go to a religious service other than your own. I was raised in a very a denomination that has a very sparse, Spartan, simple religious service. And the first time I ever went to a Catholic Mass, I was surprised. I had no idea what was going on. I could not make sense of what was happening. You stand, you sit, you chant in unison. I thought it was very, very weird. The first time I had ever gone to a Catholic Mass. Think about how shocking it would be for a Catholic to go to a Pentecostal service where people are jumping up and down and speaking in tongues. I mean, these things would be very exotic. And that's a simple example, but they're absolutely normal to the people who ordinarily go to these churches. So that's a good way to feel what culture shock would be like. The point is that our culture feels natural to us, even though it is a human creation. People have the tendency to look around at the way things are and to conclude from that that's the way things ought to be. And this leads to something that sociologists and anthropologists call ethnocentrism. The belief that your own race, nation, or culture is superior to all the others. And that's a simple function of this notion of looking around at the way things are and concluding from that that that's the way they ought to be. In philosophy, they call this the naturalistic fallacy. You cannot equate an is with an ought. You can imagine what ethnocentrism is like by simply thinking about how you felt at your high school about those idiots or heathens that went to the rival high school, or how rabid Gator fans feel about the Georgia Bulldogs or the Florida State Seminoles. I mean, this is sort of intra-societal ethnocentrism. Our team is the best, our society is the best, our language is the best, and this is all people, all groups, I think, have ethnocentric tendencies. For instance, in the United States, we say, the United States is the greatest nation on earth. Well, is the United States the greatest nation on earth? I think that totally depends on how you measure greatness. If greatness is measured in terms of military might, then this is the greatest nation on earth. If it's measured on the basis of having safe streets that are free of crime and social cohesion among its citizens, then this is certainly not the greatest nation on earth. You always pick the measuring rod. Every society picks the measuring rod or the metric that allows them to emerge as the best society. My wife was raised in Puerto Rico. We visit Puerto Rico often. If you ever fly to Puerto Rico, you'll notice that when the plane lands at the San Juan airport, all of the native Puerto Ricans on the plane break into applause and start cheering because they're back in their island, which is the greatest place on earth, right? And they're absolutely ethnocentric about their island. If you go to France, people will be, very excited about France. If you go to Vietnam, people will be very excited about Vietnam. People all around the world have this notion that the way things are here are the way that they ought to be. The opposite of ethnocentrism is cultural relativism, or the idea that culture should be judged on their own terms. The idea is that there are lots of different ways to do things, and just because our culture feels natural to us, it doesn't mean that it's the right way. There are many different ways, and so culture should be judged on their own terms. One way to examine or think about cultural relativism is by comparing the foods that are eaten around the world. Let me give you an example. This is a dish called balut that is common in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. And, you eat eggs, and when we eat eggs, we eat them when they're freshly laid. But in Southeast Asia, they enjoy eggs after the embryo has sort of halfway developed. And you look at that and say, God, that's disgusting. All right? But the reason why you think that's disgusting is because you're not used to the way that it looks, and you haven't been raised eating this dish. But if you went to Southeast Asia, you'd have an opportunity to eat it. And the truth is that it tastes remarkably like a normal hard-boiled egg, except the embryo part is crunchy. And I must admit, it is something you have to get used to. But this is something that you wouldn't have to get used to if you were raised in that culture. There's nothing inherently grosser about a half-developed embryo versus a completely undeveloped embryo. If you think about it, the whole idea of eating a chicken embryo is pretty gross as it is. And so the cultural relativist would say, this is just an example of how what is delicious in one culture may be different than what is delicious in another culture, but there's nothing that is objectively delicious. Here's another example. In some parts of Asia, it's perfectly acceptable to eat dog meat. People have dogs as pets, and they eat dogs as meat, just like how in the United States, some people have pigs as pets, and they eat pigs as meat. So you are not accustomed to eating dog meat. Most of us are, many of us are disgusted by the thought of eating dog meat. But if you think about it, the flesh of one mammal is essentially the same as the flesh of another mammal. Why is it gross to eat a dog and it's not gross to eat a cow? Have you ever gotten close to a cow and seen the snot running down their nose and the poop caked all over their hind legs and smelled what a cow smells like and saw the flies all over them? I mean, if you think about it, cows are pretty gross. So it's not inherently disgusting to eat a dog, and it's not inherently delicious to eat a cow. In Hindu culture, eating cows are taboo. They would never eat a cow, and they're disgusted by the thought of eating a cow. You might like to eat pork ribs, but observant Jews and Muslims would be horrified and grossed out by the thought of eating bacon or pork ribs or having a ham sandwich. So nothing is inherently delicious or disgusting. These things are all completely culturally determined. But there is a danger with cultural relativism. I mean, it's clear with respect to cuisine that you really can't say one type of cuisine is objectively better than another. But you know, if you can't make any moral judgments about societies because it's ethnocentric, then in a very real sense, you can't say that anything is right or wrong across cultures. And that's a little bit of a problem, right? If you're going to say everything is culturally determined, and we must examine culture from the standpoint of the culture itself, then how could we condemn anything? How could we condemn human rights violations? Hey, it's just their culture. How could we condemn, you know, some of the worst kinds of genocide or acts of terror that we have seen in history if we just say, well, you know, obviously if it was right to them, and if it's right to them, who are we to say that it's, you know, actually wrong? And so this is called the Relativist Dilemma. And I think these days most social scientists think that, you know, radical moral or radical cultural relativism is probably not a good idea. So let's take the case of the burqa. And the earlier cartoon that I showed shows the difference between the bikini as a potential marker of male oppression and the burqa as a potential marker of male oppression. Now, there are many women in Islamic societies who choose to wear a burqa. And if they choose to wear a burqa, then that is entirely their choice. And I'm sure there are many women in Islamic societies who absolutely do choose to wear a burqa. But really, if you look at that cartoon in the bottom left, is it truly morally equivalent? I don't know that anybody is forced to wear a bikini. Maybe, I don't think so. But are there women that are forced to wear a burqa? I think there are. And so many people have argued that women's rights across the world are something that we should probably press for, and that you can't look at the oppression of women in other countries and just simply say, well, it's their culture. So for the person who is not a cultural relativist, they would say, and it's risky to say this, but they would say things like, well, some cultures are not just different than other cultures, some cultures are better. And they would say things like, free speech is better than no free speech. A free press is better than a a press that's controlled by a power elite. Equality for women is better. Now, this gets a little bit thorny because there are lots of different practices that take place throughout the world where it's kind of a judgment call. The text gives the example of bullfighting. Bullfighting is probably not fun for the bull. Do we just say, well, that's just the way they do it in Spain and dismiss it as their culture? Or if you're someone who's interested in animal rights, would you say, no, that's objectively wrong. That's not a matter of cultural relativism. That's something that activists should do something about. I'm not taking any specific position on any of these things. I'm just saying this is the dilemma that we are faced with. Sometimes you have cultures within cultures. The larger culture has a set of norms and values and rituals and beliefs, and sometimes you'll have self-contained subcultures that also have their own distinct norms and values and subcultures. This is a picture of Amish subculture, where the Amish is a society within a society. I grew up in Utah. I was raised a Mormon in Utah. The Mormon subculture is a distinct subculture that's different from American society. In addition to these societies within a society, you also have sometimes subcultural groups that congeal around a set of values. So, for instance, Trekkies or Star Wars fanatics that have these conventions. They are a subculture that are based on a particular type of fandom. Or you have subcultures that are based around tattooing and body modification. And the chapter that I assigned to you shows some of these different kinds of subcultures.